Hey there. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to a place that gave you everything you use, everything you believe, everything you are. And yet, you probably know almost nothing about it. We're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, but forget the dusty textbooks, forget the boring museum displays. That sanitized version, complete fiction. The real Mesopotamia was darker, stranger, and far more violent than anything they taught you in school. This was a world of blood sacrifices, demon worship, and empires built on mountains of skulls. A world where writing was invented not for poetry, but for control. Where the first laws were carved in stone alongside brutal punishments that would make you sick. So, before we step through the portal of time, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you're ready for the truth. And drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'm always curious who's brave enough to journey into the darkness with me. Now dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe grab some water, because this journey is long, and once we start, there's no turning back. Welcome to the cradle of civilization nobody tells you about. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Birth of Everything. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing in the year 3500 BC. That's over 5,000 years ago. There are no cities anywhere on Earth. No writing. No laws. No kingdoms. Humanity lives in small wandering tribes, hunting, gathering, surviving day by day. Now open your eyes. You're standing in southern Iraq, the land between two great rivers, the Tigris to the east, the Euphrates to the west. The Greeks would later call this place Mesopotamia. It means the land between the rivers. And this is where everything changed. This is where a mysterious people appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and built something the world had never seen before. They called themselves the Sumerians. We still don't know where they came from. Their language is unlike any other language on Earth. It has no relatives, no ancestors. It's an orphan in the family of human speech. Some scholars believe they migrated from the mountains to the north. Others think they came from across the sea. But the truth is, we simply don't know. They appeared in this flat, hostile, sun-scorched land, and they stayed. And that was the first mystery, because by all logic, they should have left. The land of Sumer was a nightmare. It was a vast floodplain of mud and silt, baked hard as stone in the summer, drowned by floods in the spring. There were no trees for timber, no stone for building, no metals for tools. It was a place with almost no natural resources. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the worst places on Earth to build a civilization. And yet, they did it anyway. The Sumerians had something no one else had. They had an idea, a revolutionary, audacious, world-changing idea. They would not adapt to the land. They would force the land to adapt to them. The two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were both a blessing and a curse. Every spring, the snow would melt in the distant mountains of Anatolia. The rivers would swell. They would burst their banks. They would flood the entire region, drowning crops, destroying homes, and turning the land into an endless swamp. But the Sumerians saw opportunity where others saw only disaster. They began to dig. They dug channels. They dug canals. They dug vast networks of irrigation ditches that stretched for miles across the plain. They learned to capture the floodwaters. They learned to store them. They learned to control them. They turned the curse of the flood into the blessing of abundance. This was the birth of hydraulic civilization. For the first time in human history, a people had bent nature to their will on a massive scale. They had engineered the earth itself, and the land responded. The soil of Mesopotamia, fed by the silt of two great rivers, was astonishingly fertile. One seed of barley could yield 30, 40, even 50 seeds in return. It was the richest farmland in the ancient world. With this abundance came a surplus. With surplus came something humanity had never known before: free time. Not everyone had to farm anymore. Some people could specialize. Some became potters. Some became weavers. Some became priests. Some became soldiers. For the first time, human society became complex. But controlling water on this scale required something else, something even more revolutionary. It required cooperation. A single family could dig a small ditch, but a great canal, miles long, needed hundreds of people working together. It needed organization. It needed planning. It needed someone to give orders and someone to obey them. It needed hierarchy. It needed authority. It needed power. And so, alongside the canals, another structure began to rise in Sumer, not made of earth and water, but of power and control. The first human bureaucracy. Priests emerged as the coordinators of this vast effort. They claimed to speak for the gods. They organized the labor. They decided who would dig where. They controlled the distribution of food and water. And with control over food and water came control over life and death. This was the dark side of the Sumerian miracle. Yes, they had created abundance, but they had also created dependency. The individual farmer was now at the mercy of the system. If the priests decided you didn't deserve water, your crops died. If your crops died, your family starved. The price of civilization was freedom. The Sumerians built their homes from the only material they had, mud. They shaped the thick river clay into rectangular bricks and baked them hard in the fierce Mesopotamian sun. These mud bricks became the building blocks of everything. But mud is fragile. It crumbles. It melts in the rain. It returns to dust. This is why so much of Sumerian civilization has vanished. Unlike the Egyptians, who built with stone, the Sumerians built with earth, and the earth has reclaimed almost everything they made. But for a brief, shining moment in history, those mud brick cities were the most advanced places on the planet. By 3500 BC, the Sumerian settlements had grown. They were no longer villages. They were becoming something new, something the world had never seen. They were becoming cities. The greatest of these early cities was called Eridu. Legend says it was the first city ever built, created by the gods themselves at the beginning of time. Archaeologists have found its ruins, layer upon layer of temples, built and rebuilt over thousands of years, each one on top of the last. Eridu was a holy city, devoted to Enki, the Sumerian god of water and wisdom. It was said that Enki lived in the Abzu, the vast freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and that his temple in Eridu was the doorway to his realm. But Eridu was not alone. Other cities rose across the plain: URUK, Lagash, Nippur, each one independent, each one ruled by its own king and its own gods. This was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of rival city-states, constantly competing for land, for water, for power. And where there is competition, there is conflict. The Sumerians were not a peaceful people. They fought wars, brutal, vicious wars over water rights, over borders, over pride. They invented some of the first organized armies. They developed the first siege tactics. They built the first war chariots, heavy-wheeled vehicles pulled by donkeys, thundering across the battlefield. War, it seems, is as old as civilization itself. But the Sumerians gave the world something even more powerful than weapons. They gave the world a new way of thinking. These people, standing in the mud between two rivers, looked at the chaos of nature and saw patterns. They looked at the movement of the stars and saw order. They counted the days and created the first calendar. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. They divided the hour into 60 minutes. We still use their numbers today. The Sumerians were the first true scientists, not in the modern sense, but in spirit. They observed, they recorded, they tried to understand, but understanding required memory, and memory required something that didn't exist yet. It required a way to store information outside the human mind. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, the Sumerian world was growing more complex. The temples were managing vast amounts of goods: grain, oil, livestock, textiles. They needed to keep track of who owed what, who paid their taxes, who received rations. Memory was no longer enough. They needed to write things down. And so, in the great city of Uruk, around the year 3200 BC, a nameless Sumerian scribe picked up a sharpened reed stylus, pressed it into a soft clay tablet, and made a mark. It was a simple mark, just a wedge-shaped impression in the clay, but it changed everything. That mark was the birth of writing, the birth of history, the birth of the recorded human mind. The Sumerians called it cuneiform. We call it the beginning. But before we dive into the miracle of writing, we need to see where it was born. We need to visit the city that invented it. We need to go to URUK. And URUK was like nothing the world had ever seen before. Chapter 2. URUK, the world's first true city. Stand with me now on the dusty plain of southern Mesopotamia. The year is 3500 BC. You've been walking for days through empty wilderness. Small villages dot the landscape, clusters of mud brick huts surrounded by fields of barley. You've seen nothing larger than a few hundred people living together. And then, on the horizon, you see it. A wall. Not a fence, not a barrier. A wall. Massive, towering, stretching as far as your eye can see in both directions. It rises from the flat earth like a mountain of brick and stone, 6 miles long, 40 feet high, thick enough that chariots can race along its top. You have arrived at URUK. This is the world's first true city, and it is terrifying in its scale. As you approach the gates, you see thousands of people, more people than you knew existed in the world. Farmers bringing grain in ox-drawn carts, merchants shouting in strange accents, soldiers in leather armor carrying spears tipped with copper, priests in white robes, their faces painted, chanting prayers to gods you don't recognize. The noise is overwhelming. The smell is overpowering. Animals, sweat, smoke, spices, sewage. This is density. This is humanity concentrated. This is civilization. The gate tower looms above you. Guards watch from above. You pass through the massive archway, and suddenly you're inside. The streets are narrow and winding, packed with people pushing past each other. Children run between your legs. Dogs bark. Donkeys bray. Every few steps, someone is selling something. Bread, beer, dried fish, copper tools, clay pots. Everything here is strange and new because everything here was invented here. You look up, and your breath catches. Rising above the jumble of flat-roofed houses, dominating the entire city, is a structure unlike anything else on Earth. It is a mountain made by human hands. A massive stepped pyramid of brick, climbing toward the sky in huge rectangular stages. This is a ziggurat. The word means to build high. And high it is. The great ziggurat of URUK rises over 100 feet into the air. Its base covers acres. Its sides are painted brilliant white, and they gleam in the merciless Mesopotamian sun like a beacon visible for miles across the plain. At its summit, small as a toy from where you stand, is a temple, the house of Inanna, goddess of love, war, and power, the most feared and worshipped deity in Sumer. This ziggurat is not just a religious building. It is a statement. It is power made visible. It says, we can build mountains where there are none. We can touch the realm of the gods. We are no longer subject to nature. We have transcended it. But step closer, and you begin to see the cracks in the dream. URUK is home to somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people. This is a staggering number for the ancient world. No settlement had ever come close to this size before. And with size came problems. Dark, ugly, human problems. The streets are filthy. There is no sewage system. Waste is simply thrown into the alleys or piled against walls. In the summer heat, the smell is choking. Disease spreads fast. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. The mortality rate, especially among children, is horrific. Walk through the residential quarters, and you see the brutal inequality of urban life. Near the temple complex, the houses are large. His spacious courtyards, multiple rooms, whitewashed walls. These are the homes of priests, merchants, and officials, the elite, but pushed deeper into the city, into the tangled neighborhoods near the walls, and the houses become tiny. Single-room hovels, packed side by side, barely big enough for a family to lie down. No windows, no ventilation, just mud brick boxes where the poor struggle to survive. This is the birth of the urban underclass. For the first time in history, you have people living in the same place, breathing the same air, but inhabiting completely different worlds. The priest in his villa eats meat and drinks wine. The labourer in his hovel eats barley gruel and drinks water from a canal. Both are citizens of URUK, but only one truly lives. Crime, naturally, explodes. When you concentrate thousands of people in a confined space, when you create massive inequality, when you put the desperate next to the wealthy, violence is inevitable. Theft becomes rampant. Assault, murder, rape. The city authorities respond with brutal public punishments, beatings, mutilation, execution. The law of the city is written in blood. But despite all this darkness, despite the filth and inequality and violence, URUK thrives. Because URUK has something no village can match. It has specialization. In a village, everyone is a farmer. But in URUK, people can focus. A man can spend his entire life perfecting the art of bronze working. A woman can become the city's most skilled weaver. A family can specialize in brewing the finest beer. This specialization creates quality. It creates innovation. It creates wealth. And wealth attracts more people, which creates more specialization, which creates more wealth. It is a cycle, a feedback loop. The city feeds on itself, growing larger and larger. The engine that powers all of this is the temple complex. The temple is not just a place of worship, it is the economic heart of the city. It is a corporation, a government, and a church, all rolled into one. The temple owns vast amounts of land. It employs hundreds of workers, farmers, shepherds, fishermen, weavers, brewers, all working for the goddess Inanna, or more accurately, for the priests who speak in her name. These workers are paid in rations, barley, oil, beer, wool. The temple controls the surplus of the entire region, and it uses that control to maintain its power. This is the birth of the centralized economy. And with centralized economy comes the need for records. Who worked how many days? Who received how much grain? Who owes the temple and who has paid their dues? The priests needed a system, a way to track the flow of goods, a way to make the invisible visible. They needed writing. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, we need to talk about the king. Standing at the center of URUK's mythology is a figure so legendary that for thousands of years, people weren't sure if he was real or just a story. His name was Gilgamesh. According to the king lists, he ruled URUK around 2700 BC. He was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a giant of a man with superhuman strength. He built the great walls of URUK. He defeated demons. He searched for immortality. For centuries, scholars dismissed Gilgamesh as pure myth, but then archaeologists found something. Inscriptions, fragments, evidence that a king named Gilgamesh really did rule URUK. He was a real person. But what kind of person was he? The epic poems describe him as a tyrant, arrogant, brutal. He claimed the right to sleep with every bride on her wedding night before her husband. He forced the young men of the city into endless labor, building his monuments and walls. The people of URUK prayed to the gods for relief. Whether this is history or legend, we'll never know. But it tells us something important about the Sumerian view of kingship. Kings were not seen as benevolent. They were seen as dangerous. Necessary, perhaps, but dangerous. A king could protect you from enemies, but he could also destroy you on a whim. This is the dark truth of early urban civilization. To live in a city, to enjoy its benefits, you had to surrender something essential. You had to surrender your autonomy. You had to accept that someone else, someone more powerful, now controlled your fate. The city gave you specialization, trade, culture, and security. But it took your freedom, and once that trade was made, there was no going back. By 3200 BC, URUK was not just a city, it was a new form of human organization. It was the prototype for every city that would follow. Babylon, Athens, Rome, London, New York. All of them are children of URUK. But URUK faced a problem that every complex society in history has faced. How do you manage complexity? How do you keep track of thousands of transactions, hundreds of workers, dozens of officials, all operating at the same time? Memory wasn't enough anymore. Oral tradition wasn't enough. The priests of URUK needed something revolutionary. They needed to freeze time, to capture a thought and make it permanent. To speak to the future, they needed to invent writing. And so they did. Chapter 3. Cuneiform, the invention that changed everything. Let's go back to that moment. Imagine you're a Sumerian priest, sitting in a small room in the temple complex of URUK. The year is 3200 BC. On the floor in front of you are dozens of clay jars filled with grain, offerings from farmers, taxes from villages, tribute from distant settlements. You need to keep track of it all. You've been using a system, small clay tokens shaped like the objects they represent. A cone for grain, a sphere for a jug of oil, a cylinder for an animal. You put these tokens in clay envelopes, seal them, and mark the outside to show what's inside. It works. But it's clumsy. It's slow. And as the city grows, it's becoming impossible to manage. You need something better. So you try something new. Instead of putting the tokens inside the clay, you press them into the surface of a soft clay tablet. You make an impression, a mark, a symbol, and then you realize something extraordinary. You don't need the tokens anymore. You can just make the marks. You pick up a reed, cut from the banks of the Euphrates. You sharpen one end into a triangular point. You press it into the clay at an angle. It leaves a wedge-shaped mark. You press it again, and again. Different angles, different combinations. These marks can mean anything you want them to mean. You have just invented writing. This is cuneiform. The word comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, wedge-shaped writing. The first writing system in human history. At first, it was simple, almost childlike. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a bowl meant bowl. These were pictographs, direct representations of physical objects. But the priests quickly realized that pictures alone were limiting. How do you draw love? How do you draw a future? How do you draw because? So they evolved. They began using symbols not just for objects, but for sounds. A picture of a mouth, which in Sumerian was ka, could also represent the sound ka, in other words. This was the birth of phonetic writing, the birth of the alphabet's ancestor. Over centuries, the symbols became more abstract, more standardized. What started as pictures became combinations of wedges, fast to write, easy to read, efficient. By 2500 BC, cuneiform could express anything the human mind could think. Philosophy, law, science, poetry, lies, truth, hate, love, everything. But here's the dark side that nobody talks about. Writing was not democratic. Learning to read and write cuneiform took years, decades. It required memorizing hundreds of symbols and their combinations. It required endless practice. Only a tiny elite could do it. These were the scribes. Scribes were trained from childhood in special schools called tablet houses. The training was brutal. Students were beaten for mistakes. They copied the same texts over and over until their hands ached. Most gave up. Only the dedicated, the obedient, the intelligent survived. But those who did became part of the most powerful class in Mesopotamian society. A scribe could read a contract and tell you if you were being cheated. A scribe could write a letter to a king. A scribe could record your debts or erase them. A scribe controlled information, and information is power. Kings needed scribes. Priests needed scribes. Merchants needed scribes. But the scribes needed no one. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the interpreters of reality. If something wasn't written down, it didn't exist. If it was written down, it became truth. This is the first information monopoly in human history. The common people, the farmers and laborers who built the cities, were shut out. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. They had to trust that the scribe recording their grain delivery was honest. They had to believe that the contract they marked with their seal was fair. Most of the time, they were wrong. Writing didn't liberate humanity. It created a new form of control, but it also created something extraordinary, something that would outlast every empire and every king. It created memory. For the first time, humans could speak across time. A man could write something, die, and 1,000 years later, someone could read his words and hear his voice. Death no longer meant silence. The Sumerians wrote everything. They wrote contracts, sales of land, sales of slaves, loans with interest rates that would make a modern banker blush. They wrote receipts, inventories, tax records, endless, boring, beautiful lists of grain and sheep and copper tools. They wrote laws, rules for marriage, rules for divorce, rules for inheritance, rules for what happens when your neighbor's ox gores your slave. They wrote prayers, hymns to the gods, curses against their enemies, and they wrote stories. The greatest of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We talked about Gilgamesh before, the legendary king of Uruk. His story was passed down orally for centuries, sung by bards in the palaces and marketplaces of Sumer. But around 2100 BC, a scribe sat down and wrote it all down. The story begins with Gilgamesh as a tyrant. The gods create a wild man, Enkidu, to challenge him. They fight. They become friends. Together, they go on adventures. They slay monsters. They insult the gods. And then Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is devastated. For the first time, he understands that he too will die. He cannot accept it. He goes on a desperate quest to find immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth. He meets the only human who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life. He learns the secret of a plant that restores youth. But on his way home, a serpent steals the plant and eats it. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed. He has failed. He will die like every other human. But he realizes something. Immortality is not in living forever. It's in what you leave behind. He looks at the great walls of Uruk, the walls he built, and he understands. His name will live on. His works will endure. This is the first great piece of literature in human history, written 4,000 years ago, and it asks the same questions we still ask today. What is the meaning of life? Why do we die? How do we deal with loss? What will we leave behind? The Epic of Gilgamesh contains something else, something shocking. It contains a flood story, a great deluge sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A man builds a boat. He saves his family and pairs of animals. The flood comes. Everyone else dies. The boat lands on a mountain. The man sends out birds to find dry land. Sound familiar? This story was written 1,000 years before the Bible. The story of Noah's Ark is not original. It's Mesopotamian. But Gilgamesh is not the only thing they wrote. They wrote mathematics, complex equations, quadratic formulas, the Pythagorean theorem, centuries before Pythagoras. They wrote astronomy. They tracked the movements of Venus with shocking accuracy. They predicted eclipses. They wrote medicine, lists of symptoms, diagnoses, prescriptions using herbs and minerals. They wrote magic. And this is where things get dark. The Mesopotamians believed that writing had power, literal, magical power. A curse written on a clay tablet and buried in your enemy's house could destroy him. A love spell inscribed on a piece of lead and hidden under a woman's bed could make her obsessed with you. Thousands of these tablets have been found. Curse tablets, binding spells, necromantic invocations. They would write the name of a demon and then scratch it out, symbolically destroying it. They would write prayers to protect themselves from evil spirits. They would write threats to the gods, demanding action. Writing, for them, was not just communication. It was a weapon, a tool of control over both the living and the dead. This is the double-edged sword of cuneiform. It gave humanity history, literature, science, law, but it also gave humanity a new way to lie, manipulate, curse, and control. Every technology is like this. Every tool can be used for good or evil. The Sumerians understood this. They knew that knowledge was dangerous, but they wrote it down anyway, because once you open that door, once you start recording reality, you can never go back. The world of oral tradition, where stories changed with each telling, where memory was fluid, where the past was negotiable, that world was over. The age of the written word had begun, and with it came something else, something inevitable: conflict. Because now, kingdoms had records. They had treaties. They had borders written in stone. And when borders are permanent, when debts are recorded, when insults are documented, forgiveness becomes harder. War becomes easier. The age of writing was also the age of empire, and the first true empire in human history was about to be born. Not by a Sumerian, but by a conqueror from the north. His name was Sargon, and he would change everything. Chapter 4: The Akkadian Conquest, First Empire on Earth. Every great empire begins with a story, and the story of the first empire begins with a baby floating in a river. According to legend, in the city of Atsupiranu, a priestess gave birth to a child in secret. The father was unknown, perhaps a god, perhaps a stranger. The priestess could not keep the baby, so she did what desperate mothers have done throughout history. She placed the infant in a reed basket. She sealed it with pitch, and she set it adrift on the Euphrates River. The basket floated downstream. A man drawing water from the river found it. His name was Aki. He was a gardener, a man of low status, but he had compassion. He took the baby home. He raised him as his own son. The child's name was Sargon. This is the official story, written down centuries later by Sargon's own scribes. Does any of it sound familiar? It should, because this is the same story that would be told about Moses 1500 years later, about Romulus and Remus, about dozens of legendary heroes, the abandoned child, the river, the humble rescuer, the rise from nothing to greatness. It's a template, a myth, a piece of propaganda. But here's what we know for certain. Around 2334 BC, a man named Sargon seized power in the city of Akkad. We don't know exactly where Akkad was. Its ruins have never been found, but we know it was somewhere in central Mesopotamia, north of Sumer. Sargon was not Sumerian. He spoke a different language. Akkadian, a Semitic language, ancestor of Hebrew and Arabic. He was an outsider, an upstart, a nobody, and within a few years, he conquered the entire known world. How did he do it? The Sumerian city-states had been fighting each other for centuries. Against URUK, Lagash against Umma. Endless petty wars over water rights and border disputes. Their armies were militias, farmers called up in times of war, poorly trained, poorly equipped. They would fight for a season, then go home to their fields. Sargon created something different. He created the world's first professional standing army. These were not farmers. They were soldiers, full-time warriors, men who did nothing but train, fight, and conquer. He armed them with composite bows, powerful weapons that could pierce armor at a distance. He equipped them with bronze weapons of higher quality than anything the Sumerians had. But more than weapons, he gave them something revolutionary. He gave them loyalty to a person, not a city. Sumerian soldiers fought for their home, for their temple, for their local god. Sargon's soldiers fought for Sargon. He paid them well. He gave them land. He gave them a share of the plunder. He made them rich. And in return, they made him unstoppable. City by city, Sargon marched south into Sumer. The great cities fell. URUK, Lagash, Nippur. One by one, the proud city-states that had stood independent for over 1,000 years were crushed. Sargon didn't just defeat them. He humiliated them. He destroyed their walls. He installed his own governors. He forced the defeated kings to march in chains through the streets of Akkad. According to his inscriptions, he washed his weapons in the Persian Gulf. He marched to the Mediterranean Sea. He conquered from horizon to horizon. 54 cities, he claimed, bowed before him. The Akkadian Empire was born. The first multi-ethnic, multilingual empire in human history, and Sargon styled himself as something new, not just king of a city, but king of Akkad, king of Kish, king of Sumer, king of the four quarters of the world. He claimed dominion over everything. But here's the problem with empire. Conquest is easy. Control is hard. The Sumerians hated Sargon. They saw him as a barbarian, a foreign tyrant who had stolen their freedom. Revolts broke out constantly. Cities rebelled. Local leaders tried to restore independence, and Sargon crushed them. Brutally. His inscriptions boast about it. He burned rebellious cities to the ground. He executed their leaders. He deported entire populations, scattering them across the empire so they could never unite again. This was the birth of imperial terror, the deliberate use of overwhelming violence to frighten others into submission. It worked. For a while, Sargon ruled for 56 years, an astonishing length for an ancient king. He died, probably of old age, around 2279 BC. His empire passed to his sons, and this is where things get dark. His son, Rimush, ruled for only 9 years before he was murdered, assassinated by his own servants, using their cylinder seals as weapons. They beat him to death with the very symbols of their office. His other son, Manishtushu, also died violently, killed in a palace conspiracy. The empire was crumbling. But then came Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin was even more ambitious than his grandfather. He declared himself not just a king, but a god. He had himself depicted wearing the horned crown of divinity. He built temples to himself. He demanded worship. This was unprecedented, blasphemous, terrifying. And for a while, it worked. Naram-Sin expanded the empire further than Sargon ever had. He crushed rebellions with even greater brutality. He erected victory monuments showing him trampling his enemies underfoot, their broken bodies piled beneath his feet. But then, something happened. Around 2150 BC, the Akkadian Empire began to collapse. Not from rebellion, not from invasion, from something far worse: climate change. Scientists analyzing ancient soil samples have discovered something shocking. Around 2200 BC, a massive drought struck Mesopotamia, the worst in thousands of years. The rain stopped, the rivers shrank, crops failed, famine spread, people starved, cities emptied. The empire's infrastructure, built on agricultural surplus, disintegrated. Nomadic tribes from the north, the Gutians, swept down from the mountains. They found not a mighty empire, but a dying carcass. They tore it apart. By 2154 BC, the Akkadian Empire was gone. Akkad itself was abandoned, lost, never to be found again. Later Mesopotamian scribes created a legend to explain it. They said that Naram-Sin had offended the gods. He had destroyed a sacred temple, and the gods sent a curse upon Akkad. They wrote a poem called The Curse of Akkad. It describes the city in its final days. The canals choked with weeds, the streets empty, the palaces silent, the gods themselves abandoning the city, leaving it to ruin. The poem ends with a chilling image. On Akkad, may destruction be poured out. May it be cursed by all the gods. May its ruin last forever. And it did. But the Akkadian Empire, despite its destruction, left something permanent behind. It left the idea of empire. Before Sargon, the world was city-states, small, independent, constantly squabbling. After Sargon, the world wanted empires, unified territories, single rulers commanding vast armies and multiple peoples. Every conqueror who came after, from Hammurabi to Alexander to Napoleon, was following the template Sargon created. The Akkadian language, too, survived. It became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for over 2,000 years. Long after Akkad fell, its language remained the language of diplomacy, of trade, of power, and the legacy of terror. That survived too. Sargon taught the world a dark lesson. Violence works. If you're willing to be more brutal than your enemies, if you're willing to destroy cities and murder populations, you can build an empire. It's an ugly truth, but it's a truth every empire in history has learned. For over a century after the fall of Akkad, Mesopotamia descended into chaos. The Gutians ruled the north. Small Sumerian city-states re-emerged in the south, fighting each other as they always had. But around 2112 BC, a new power rose from the ashes. The third dynasty of Ur. The Sumerians had their revenge. For one brief, shining moment, they rebuilt their civilization. They created a centralized bureaucratic state that was, in its own way, even more oppressive than Akkad had been. But it didn't last. Around 2000 BC, Ur fell to invaders from the east, the Elamites. Mesopotamia was broken again, fragmented, weak. But from this chaos, a new city began to rise. A city that had been a minor provincial town, a backwater. Nothing special, until it was everything. Its name was Babylon, and its greatest king was about to write his name into history, not with a sword, but with a law code. Chapter 5. Babylon Rises, the Code of Hammurabi. Let's travel forward in time. The year is 1792 BC. Nearly 2,000 years have passed since the first cities rose in Sumer. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have come and gone. The great cities of old, URUK and Ur, are fading into legend. But Mesopotamia endures. And now, a new city stands at the center of the world. Babylon. The name means Gate of the Gods. It sits on the Euphrates River, in the heart of Mesopotamia. For centuries, it was nothing special. A small trading town, a provincial capital, easily forgotten. But then, a king came to power who refused to be forgotten. His name was Hammurabi. When Hammurabi took the throne in 1792 BC, Babylon was just one of many competing kingdoms. To the north, the powerful kingdom of Assyria. To the south, the coalition of Sumerian cities. To the east, Elam. To the west, the Amorite kingdoms. Babylon was surrounded, vulnerable, weak. Hammurabi spent the first 30 years of his reign playing the game. He made alliances. He broke alliances. He married off his daughters to foreign kings. He sent gifts. He flattered. He lied. And all the while, he built his army. Then, in the final 13 years of his reign, he struck, city by city, kingdom by kingdom. He conquered them all. He defeated Elam. He crushed the Sumerian south. He turned on his former allies and destroyed them. By the time he was done, Hammurabi controlled all of Mesopotamia. He was not as flashy as Sargon. He didn't claim to be a god like Naram-Sin, but he was more effective, because Hammurabi understood something that earlier conquerors did not. Conquest is easy. Administration is hard. You can take a city by force, but how do you keep it? How do you make a dozen different peoples, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, obey you? The Akkadians had used terror. Sargon crushed rebellions. Naram-Sin deported populations. Hammurabi chose a different path. He chose law. Around 1754 BC, near the end of his reign, Hammurabi commissioned a massive stone monument, a black basalt stela over 7 feet tall. At the top, carved in relief, is an image of Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. Shamash is seated on a throne. He hands Hammurabi a rod and ring, symbols of royal authority. The message is clear. Hammurabi's power comes from the gods themselves. Below the image, covering the rest of the stele in dense columns of cuneiform, are 282 laws. This is the Code of Hammurabi, the most famous law code in ancient history. It was not the first law code. The Sumerians had created law codes centuries earlier, but Hammurabi's code was different. It was comprehensive. It covered everything: marriage, divorce, inheritance, property, crime, commerce, agriculture, slavery. And it was brutal. The code is famous for one phrase: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This sounds like justice. Proportional punishment. If you injure someone, you suffer the same injury. But read closer, and you see the darkness. Law number 196. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Fair enough. But keep reading. Law number 198. If he put out the eye of a freed man, he shall pay 1 gold mina. Wait. What? If you blind a slave, you don't lose your eye. You pay a fine. The law is not equal. It depends on your social class. And it gets worse. Law number 200. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. Law number 201. If he knock out the teeth of a freed man, he shall pay 1/3 of a gold mina. Again, class matters. Law 209. If a man strike a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for her loss. Law 210. If the woman die, his daughter shall be put to death. Read that again. If you cause a woman to miscarry, you pay a fine. But if she dies, your daughter is executed. Not you, your daughter. You are punished by watching your child die. This is not justice. This is horror. The code is filled with these laws. Collective punishment. Brutal penalties. Inequality baked into every line. Law number 229. If a builder build a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Fair. You built a bad house. Someone died. You're responsible. But Law 230. If it kill the son of the owner, the son of that builder shall be put to death. Again, your son dies for your mistake. Law 129. If a man's wife be surprised in adultery with another man, both shall be tied and thrown into the water. But the husband may pardon his wife, and the king may pardon his subject. Adultery is punishable by drowning. But notice, the husband can pardon his wife. The wife has no say in pardoning her lover. She has no agency. She is property. And speaking of property, the code treats women, children, and slaves as property. Law 115. If a man be in debt and sell his wife, son, or daughter, or bind them over to service, they shall work for 3 years in the house of the purchaser, and in the 4th year they shall be set free. You can sell your family to pay your debts. Law 116. If a slave say to his master, "You are not my master," his master shall cut off his ear. Speak out of turn, lose an ear. This is the reality of Hammurabi's justice. But here's the thing. As brutal as it was still revolutionary. Because before Hammurabi, justice was arbitrary. A king could punish you however he wanted. A noble could abuse you without consequence. Now, at least, the rules were written down. You knew what the punishment would be. You knew what the law was. It was unfair, yes, but it was predictable. And predictability, in a chaotic world, is a form of freedom. Hammurabi had copies of his law code erected in temples and public squares across his empire. Anyone could read it. Anyone could know their rights, such as they were. This is the birth of public law. The idea that the law should be visible, knowable, the same for everyone. Even if everyone didn't include women, slaves, or the poor. But Hammurabi's code did something else. Something even more important. It established the principle that the king was bound by law. Yes, Hammurabi made the laws. But once they were written in stone, he couldn't arbitrarily change them. He had to follow them too. This is the beginning of the rule of law. The idea that even the most powerful person in the state is subject to rules. It's an idea that would take thousands of years to fully develop. But it started here, in Babylon, with Hammurabi. The stele itself was discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists in the ancient city of Susa, in modern-day Iran. It had been looted centuries earlier by Elamite invaders, carried off as a trophy. Today, it sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris. You can go see it. You can read the laws, if you know cuneiform. And if you do, you'll see something chilling at the very end. A curse. Hammurabi knew that future kings might try to erase his name, deface his monument, claim his laws as their own. So he wrote a curse. A long, detailed, terrifying curse. He calls on the gods to destroy anyone who alters his stele, to bring plague, famine, defeat in battle, to make their reign short and miserable, to erase their name from history. And then, the final line, may the great gods curse him with a curse that cannot be loosened. Even in death, Hammurabi demanded obedience. Hammurabi ruled for 43 years. Under his reign, Babylon transformed from a minor city into the cultural and political center of Mesopotamia. It would remain so, on and off, for the next 1500 years. Long after Hammurabi died, long after his dynasty fell, Babylon endured. It became a symbol, a legend, a city of wonders. But the Babylon of Hammurabi was not yet the Babylon of legend. That would come later. For now, Babylon was simply a powerful kingdom, with a ruthless king and a law code written in stone. But the world of Mesopotamia was about to grow darker, because the laws of Hammurabi governed the living. But what about the dead? What about the spirits? The demons? The ghosts that walked the night? For that, you needed something else. You needed magic. Chapter 6. The Mesopotamian Mind. Science, Math, and Dark Magic. Look up at the night sky. Count to 60. Check the time. It's divided into 60 minutes. Each minute into 60 seconds. Look at a circle. 360 degrees. Look at a calendar. 7 days in a week. Now ask yourself, why? Why these numbers? Why not 10? Why not 100? The answer is simple and ancient, because the Mesopotamians decided it 5,000 years ago, and we still live by their rules. The Mesopotamians were obsessed with numbers, with patterns, with order. They looked at the chaos of the world and saw hidden structure. They counted everything: days, months, years, the movements of stars, the cycles of the moon, the flooding of rivers, and they wrote it all down. Their mathematics was sophisticated, shockingly sophisticated. They used a base 60 number system. Sexagesimal, we call it now. Instead of counting to 10 and starting over, they counted to 60. Why 60? Because 60 is useful. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It's the most flexible number for calculation and division. Try dividing 10 by 3. You get 3.333, repeating forever. Try dividing 60 by 3. You get 20. Clean. Simple. Perfect. They could do multiplication, division, square roots. They calculated compound interest. They solved quadratic equations. A clay tablet from around 1800 BC shows a problem, a triangle with sides of 30, 40, and 50. What's the area? They solved it. Correctly, using what we now call the Pythagorean theorem, 1200 years before Pythagoras was born. They were not primitive. They were brilliant. But mathematics was not just abstract. It was practical. They used it to survey land, to calculate the volume of grain storage, to predict floods, to build canals and ziggurats, and they used it to watch the sky. The Mesopotamians were the world's first astronomers. They tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They called them the wandering stars. They knew that the moon moved through the sky in a 29.5-day cycle. They knew that the solar year was 365 and a quarter days long. They created the lunar calendar, 12 months of 29 or 30 days each. They added extra months every few years to keep it aligned with the solar year. This is the origin of the leap year. They predicted eclipses, solar and lunar, with stunning accuracy. Imagine being an ancient farmer and having a priest tell you, months in advance, that the sun would go dark on a specific day, and then it happens. You would believe anything that priest told you. This is the power of knowledge. But the Mesopotamians didn't separate science from religion. For them, the stars were gods. The planets were divine messengers. The movements of Venus, the goddess Inanna, could predict war or peace, love or disaster. This is the birth of astrology. They believed that the gods wrote the future in the sky, and if you could read it, you could know what was coming. Kings employed entire teams of astronomer priests. Their job was to watch the sky every night and report any unusual phenomena. A comet, a meteor, an eclipse. These were omens, messages from the gods, and they had to be interpreted. The Mesopotamians developed massive libraries of omen texts, thousands of clay tablets, cataloguing every possible celestial event and what it meant. If the moon is eclipsed in the month of Nisan, the king will die. If Venus appears in the east before sunrise, there will be abundant rain. If Mars moves backward in the sky, the army will be defeated. They took this seriously, deadly seriously. If an omen predicted the king's death, they had a solution. They would find a substitute king, a commoner, a criminal, someone expendable. They would dress him in royal robes, seat him on the throne, declare him king. For 100 days he would live as king, and the real king would hide, pretending to be a commoner. At the end of 100 days, the substitute king would be killed, poisoned, strangled, buried with full royal honours. The omen was fulfilled. The danger was past. The real king could return. This actually happened, multiple times. We have records of it. Imagine being that substitute. Imagine 100 days of luxury, knowing that at the end, you will die. This is the darkness at the heart of Mesopotamian science. They understood the sky. They could predict its movements, but they interpreted it through fear, through superstition, through the belief that the gods were capricious, angry, and constantly demanding appeasement. Their medicine was the same way, brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Mesopotamian doctors could perform surgery. They could set broken bones. They could stitch wounds. They had an extensive knowledge of herbs and minerals. They knew that willow bark could reduce fever. That opium could kill pain. That honey could prevent infection. They wrote diagnostic manuals, descriptions of symptoms, diseases, treatments. One tablet describes a patient with a fever, cough, and difficulty breathing. The diagnosis, lung infection. The treatment, steam inhalation with herbs. This is real medicine. But they also believed that most diseases were caused by demons, not germs, not bacteria. Daemons, invisible spirits that entered your body and made you sick. So treatment involved not just medicine, but exorcism. A doctor would prescribe herbs, and a priest would prescribe incantations. They would write spells on clay tablets and bury them under your bed. They would burn foul-smelling substances to drive away the demon. They would recite prayers to the healing gods. And if you got better, both the doctor and the priest took credit. The line between science and magic was invisible, because for the Mesopotamians, they were the same thing. Understanding the world and controlling the world were inseparable. And nowhere was this more true than in their practice of divination. Divination is the art of reading signs, of finding hidden messages in random events. The Mesopotamians were masters of it. They practiced extispicy, the reading of animal entrails. A priest would sacrifice a sheep. He would cut it open. He would examine the liver, the lungs, the intestines. Every bump, every discoloration, every unusual feature was a message from the gods. They had clay models of livers, covered in cuneiform inscriptions, showing what each part meant. If the liver has a protrusion on the right side, the army will be victorious. If the gallbladder is swollen, the king's enemy is plotting against him. This was not random. It was a systematic, detailed, pseudo-scientific practice. And kings never made major decisions without consulting the entrails. Should we go to war? Kill a sheep. Read its liver. Should we sign a treaty? Kill a sheep. Read its liver. Entire battles were decided by the shape of an organ. They also practiced oneiromancy, the interpretation of dreams. Dreams were messages from the gods, or warnings from the dead. If you dreamed of falling, it meant you would lose your position. If you dreamed of flying, it meant you would gain power. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, someone in your family would die. Dream interpretation manuals filled entire libraries. And then there was the darkest practice of all, necromancy, communication with the dead. The Mesopotamians believed that the dead did not rest peacefully. They descended to a dark underworld called URUK, a place of dust and darkness. No light, no joy, just endless, hollow existence. The dead were envious of the living. They could be dangerous, but they could also be contacted. Necromancers would perform rituals at grave sites. They would dig holes in the ground and pour libations of beer, honey, and blood. They would recite incantations, calling the spirits to rise. And the dead would answer. They would speak through the necromancer. They would reveal secrets, hidden treasures, the identities of murderers, the plans of enemies. But summoning the dead was dangerous, because once you opened that door, once you called them back, they didn't always want to leave. Ghosts could attach themselves to you, follow you home, haunt you, drive you mad. The Mesopotamians lived in terror of ghosts. They buried their dead with offerings, food, drink, personal belongings, to keep them happy, to keep them fed. If a spirit was neglected, if its descendants forgot to make offerings, it would return as a vengeful ghost. It would bring disease, nightmares, madness, death. And to protect against these spirits, you needed magic. The Mesopotamians created thousands of protective amulets, clay tablets inscribed with spells, cylinder seals with images of protective demons. Yes, protective demons, because not all demons were evil. The most famous is Pazuzu, a hideous creature with a dog-like face, a scaly body, bird talons, and 4 wings. He was the demon of the southwest wind, bringer of locusts and famine, but he was also the protector against other, worse demons, especially Lamashtu, a female demon who killed infants and pregnant women. To protect your child, you would place an amulet of Pazuzu in the nursery. You would recite prayers to him. You would ask an evil demon to protect you from an even worse one. This is the Mesopotamian worldview. The universe is not benevolent. The gods are not kind. Demons are everywhere. You survive by knowledge, by ritual, by constant vigilance, by making deals with forces you don't fully understand, hoping they'll protect you instead of destroy you. And nowhere is this clearer than in the curse tablets. If someone wronged you, if they stole from you, cheated you, betrayed you, you couldn't always go to the authorities. So you went to a priest or a magician, and you commissioned a curse. They would take a clay tablet. They would inscribe the name of your enemy. They would write down everything you wanted to happen to them. May their crops fail. May their children die. May their house burn. May they be forgotten. Then they would bury the tablet in a graveyard, or throw it into a river, or hide it in your enemy's house. And they believed it would work. Thousands of these curse tablets have been found, buried in ancient ruins, hidden in wells and tombs, and some of them are chilling. May Shamash, god of justice, strike down the one who stole my silver. May his hands wither. May his eyes go blind. May his tongue rot in his mouth. These were not empty threats. People believed this. They feared this. A curse, properly written, properly placed, could destroy you. This is the shadow side of Mesopotamian genius. Yes, they invented mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, but they also lived in constant fear. Fear of demons, fear of ghosts, fear of curses, fear of the gods. Their science could not free them from their terror. It only gave them more sophisticated ways to negotiate with it. And nowhere was this terror more weaponized than in the empire that would come next. An empire built not on law or trade or culture, but on pure, calculated, systematic fear, the empire of Assyria. Chapter 7. Assyria, the empire of blood. Let me tell you what it was like to face the Assyrian army. You're standing on the walls of your city. You've heard the rumors. Entire kingdoms have fallen. Cities erased from existence. Populations slaughtered or deported. And now, they're here. On the horizon, you see them. Thousands of soldiers, row after row, stretching as far as you can see. The sun glints off their iron weapons. Iron, not bronze. Harder, sharper, deadlier. They march in perfect formation. Silent, disciplined, professional. This is not a militia of farmers. This is a machine built for one purpose: destruction. As they approach, they set up camp. Massive siege engines appear. Battering rams, taller than houses, covered in metal plates. Siege towers, rolling fortresses that can bring soldiers directly to the top of your walls. And then, the siege begins. They don't rush. They don't attack wildly. They are methodical. They dig tunnels under your walls. They pound your gates with rams. They rain arrows and stones on you from a distance. You try to hold out, but your food runs low. Your water runs out. Disease spreads. And all the while, you can see them, camped outside, eating well, drinking, laughing, waiting. Finally, the wall breaks, or the gate gives way, or someone inside, starving and desperate, opens a door. The Assyrians pour in. And what happens next is not war. It's butchery. They don't just kill your soldiers. They kill everyone. Men, women, children, the elderly, the sick. They burn your temple. They loot your palace. They smash your statues. And then, the worst part, they take the survivors, the strong ones, the young ones, and they march them away in chains. You will never see your home again. This is not an exaggeration. This is what the Assyrians did, over and over, for 300 years, and they were proud of it. The Assyrian Empire emerged in northern Mesopotamia around 911 BC. It was not the first empire in the region, but it was the most terrifying. The Assyrians were not interested in trade, or culture, or diplomacy. They were interested in one thing: domination. Their kings have names that sound like weapons: Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal. These were not philosopher kings. They were warlords, and they built the most efficient military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The Assyrian army was the first to fully weaponize iron. While other kingdoms were still using bronze, the Assyrians had iron swords, iron spears, iron armor. Iron is more common than tin, easier to produce, cheaper, and harder. An iron blade could shatter a bronze sword. But weapons were only part of it. The Assyrians perfected siege warfare. They didn't just attack cities. They strangled them, surrounded them, cut off all supply lines, and waited. Their siege engines were terrifying. Battering rams with metal-tipped heads, mounted on wheeled platforms. Some had towers built on top, allowing archers to fire down into the city while the rams smashed the gate. They dug tunnels. They built ramps. They diverted rivers to flood walls or drain moats. No city was impregnable. No wall was too high. If you defied Assyria, you died. But here's what made the Assyrians truly terrifying. They didn't just defeat you. They wanted you to know what defeat meant. They created propaganda. Visual, brutal, inescapable propaganda. In the palaces of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, archaeologists have found something chilling. Enormous stone panels, bas-reliefs, carved images covering entire walls. They depict Assyrian victories, but they don't show glorious battles. They show what came after: prisoners being impaled on stakes, families being burned alive, cities being razed, men having their eyes gouged out, tongues cut out, hands cut off, heads piled in massive pyramids outside city gates. One relief shows a king, sitting on his throne, calmly eating a meal. In the background, bodies hang from trees. A severed head dangles from a branch. This was not hidden. This was displayed proudly. This was meant to be seen. The message was clear. This is what happens when you resist. And it worked. Cities heard what happened to those who fought, and they surrendered without a fight. The Assyrians didn't conquer through superior numbers. They conquered through terror. But the Assyrians were not mindless brutes. They were organized, bureaucratic, efficient. They invented the imperial road system, paved highways connecting all parts of the empire, allowing troops to move quickly, allowing messages to travel fast. They created the first efficient postal system, relay stations every few miles, messengers changing horses. A letter could travel from one end of the empire to the other in days. This is infrastructure. This is administration. They were brutal, but they were also smart, and they understood something important. Conquest is easy. Control is hard. So they developed a policy, a dark, effective policy. Mass deportation. When the Assyrians conquered a kingdom, they didn't just take tribute. They took the people. They would round up entire populations, thousands, tens of thousands, and march them across the empire. Israelites were deported to Assyria, Babylonians to Egypt, Elamites to Syria. They scattered peoples so thoroughly that they could never unite, never rebel. You can't fight for your homeland if your homeland no longer exists. This is genocide. Not through murder, but through erasure. Estimates suggest that over 4 million people were forcibly relocated during the Assyrian Empire. 4 million lives destroyed, families shattered, cultures erased. And the Assyrians recorded it all, proudly. One inscription of King Sennacherib boasts, "I deported 46 strong cities and countless small towns, 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, I brought away. 200,000 people, spoken of like inventory, like grain or livestock." But here's the strangest thing about Assyria. Despite all this brutality, they were also patrons of learning. King Ashurbanipal, one of the most ruthless conquerors in Assyrian history, was also a scholar. He created the Library of Nineveh, one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world. He sent scribes across the empire to collect every tablet they could find, every text, every story, every piece of knowledge, 25,000 clay tablets, stored in his palace. This is where we found the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. This is where we found omen texts, medical texts, mathematical texts, astronomical records. The Assyrians destroyed cultures, but they also preserved them. It's a paradox, a contradiction, but that's empire. It destroys and creates. It burns and preserves. It kills and remembers. At its height, the Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt to Iran, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. But it couldn't last. Because terror is not loyalty. Fear is not love. And when the Assyrians showed weakness, the world rose against them. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes attacked Assyria. They besieged Nineveh, the great capital, the heart of the empire. After 3 months, the walls fell. And what happened next was revenge. The city was destroyed, utterly, completely, burned to the ground. The palaces were smashed, the temples looted, the library scattered. The Assyrian Empire, which had terrorized the world for 3 centuries, was erased in a matter of weeks. Nineveh was buried under sand and forgotten. For 2,000 years, people thought it was a legend, a mythical city from the Bible, until archaeologists in the 1800s dug it up and found the bones, thousands of skeletons, bodies thrown into mass graves, evidence of massacre. The Assyrians had taught the world how to use terror, and in the end, the world used it against them. This is the lesson of Assyria. You can build an empire on fear, but fear is a fragile foundation, and when it cracks, everything falls. Chapter 8. The Fall and the Legacy. From the ashes of Assyria, something unexpected happened. Babylon rose again. Not as a minor kingdom, not as a regional power, as an empire, one last time. The Neo-Babylonian Empire. The final act of Mesopotamian glory. And it was glorious. The man who made it happen was Nebuchadnezzar II. He took the throne in 605 BC. His name means Nabu, protect my son. Nabu was the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. Nebuchadnezzar would need both. He inherited a kingdom fresh from victory. His father, Nabopolassar, had helped destroy Assyria. Now Nebuchadnezzar would build something greater. He expanded the empire. He conquered Syria. He invaded Judah. Twice. In 586 BC, he sacked Jerusalem. He destroyed Solomon's temple. He took the Jewish elite captive and marched them back to Babylon. This is the Babylonian captivity, one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history. For the Jews, Babylon became a symbol of oppression, of exile, of loss. But for the Babylonians, this was triumph. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted the world to see it. He rebuilt Babylon into the most magnificent city on earth. Imagine walking through the Ishtar Gate. It's massive, over 40 feet tall, made of brilliant blue-glazed brick, covered in golden images of bulls and dragons, the sacred animals of the gods Marduk and Adad. You pass through the gate, and you're on the processional way. A wide avenue, paved with limestone, bordered by walls decorated with 120 lions. This road leads to the heart of the city, to the great ziggurat, Itmananki, the foundation of heaven and earth. This is the ziggurat that inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It rose 300 feet into the sky, 7 massive tiers. At the summit, a temple to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. To climb to the top was to ascend from earth to heaven, from the mortal world to the realm of the gods. It must have been breathtaking. But there was another wonder, one that became even more famous: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ancient writers described them as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Terraced gardens, rising high above the city, trees and flowers and vines cascading down like a green waterfall, exotic plants from across the empire, watered by an elaborate system of pumps and canals. It was said that Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife, Amytis. She was from the green mountains of Media. She missed the forests and hills of her homeland. So Nebuchadnezzar built her a mountain, in the middle of a flat, dusty plain. If the story is true, it's one of the most romantic gestures in history. But here's the problem. We've never found them. Archaeologists have excavated Babylon extensively. They've found the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the ziggurat's foundation, but no trace of the Hanging Gardens. Some scholars think they never existed, that they were a legend, a confused memory of gardens in Nineveh, not Babylon. Others think they're still buried, waiting to be discovered. We may never know, but real or not, the Hanging Gardens became a symbol of beauty, of human ambition, of the impossible made possible. And that's fitting, because Babylon itself became a symbol. For the Greeks and Romans who came after, Babylon represented the height of Eastern luxury and power. For the Jews, it represented captivity and oppression. For Christians, it became a metaphor for sin and corruption. Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, in the book of Revelation. For centuries, the word Babylon meant decadence, excess, moral decay. But that's not fair. That's not the whole story. Babylon was also a center of learning, of science, of literature. Babylonian astronomers refined the calculations of earlier Sumerians. They could predict planetary movements with astonishing accuracy. Babylonian mathematicians developed algebra. They calculated the positions of celestial bodies using complex equations. This knowledge would later pass to the Greeks, to the Arabs. To the Renaissance Europeans, Babylon's intellectual legacy is part of the foundation of modern science. But all empires fall, and Babylon's fall came swiftly. In 539 BC, a new power emerged from the east, Persia. Led by Cyrus the Great, the Persian army marched on Babylon. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, was unpopular. He had neglected the city. He had offended the priests of Marduk. When Cyrus arrived, the city surrendered without a fight. According to Cyrus's own account, he entered Babylon peacefully. He claimed to be liberating the city from a bad king. He restored the temples. He freed the captive peoples. He allowed the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Whether that's propaganda or truth, we'll never fully know. But one thing is certain: the age of Mesopotamian empires was over. Babylon would remain an important city for centuries under Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman rule. But it was no longer the center of the world. By the time of Christ, Babylon was already crumbling, its great ziggurat collapsing, its palaces empty. By the Middle Ages, it was buried under sand, forgotten. And that's the tragedy of Mesopotamia. Egypt left pyramids, massive stone monuments that still stand today. Greece and Rome left temples, aqueducts, amphitheaters, but Mesopotamia built with mud, and mud returns to dust. The great cities of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon are gone, buried under the deserts of Iraq. For thousands of years, they were lost, forgotten. The Bible mentioned Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, but people thought they were legends, myths, until the 1800s. That's when European archaeologists began to dig, and they found something astonishing. Entire cities, buried under massive mounds of earth. Tells, they're called in Arabic. They found palaces, temples, libraries full of clay tablets. They found the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, the Assyrian bas-reliefs. They found proof that these ancient stories were real, and they found something else. Something that changed history. They found that the Bible was not unique. The story of the Great Flood, Mesopotamian. The Garden of Eden, Mesopotamian. The concept of law written by divine authority, Mesopotamian. Suddenly, the Western world had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their civilization, their religion, their entire worldview had roots in a culture they had forgotten. The legacy of Mesopotamia is everywhere, even if you don't see it. Every time you check the time, you're using their base 60 system. Every time you look at a calendar, you're following their division of the year. Every time you sign a contract, you're participating in a legal tradition they invented. The words alcohol, algebra, chemistry all come from Arabic, but the concepts, Mesopotamian. The idea of a written law code, the idea of a professional army, the idea of a centralized state, all Mesopotamian. They invented the city, the empire, the bureaucracy. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy. They created the blueprint for civilization itself. But they also gave us something darker. They showed us that civilization requires hierarchy, control, oppression, that the price of order is freedom, that every great city is built on the backs of those who have no choice. They showed us that knowledge and power are inseparable, that writing is control, that law is a weapon. They showed us that humans are capable of astonishing beauty and horrifying cruelty, often at the same time. The ziggurat and the impalement stake, the library and the deportation, the law code and the curse tablet. This is the Mesopotamian legacy, and it's our legacy too, because we are still living in the world they created. Today, the lands of ancient Mesopotamia are modern Iraq, and Iraq has not been kind to its past. The Iraq War, the Gulf War, ISIS. Decades of conflict have destroyed countless archaeological sites. Looters have ransacked museums. Smugglers have sold priceless artifacts on the black market. Ancient cities that survived for thousands of years have been bulldozed in a generation. The ziggurat of Ur still stands, partially, reconstructed by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. The Ishtar Gate is in Berlin, taken by German archaeologists in the early 1900s, rebuilt in a museum. The Code of Hammurabi is in Paris, taken by the French. The great civilizations of Mesopotamia are now scattered across Western museums. Some call it preservation, others call it theft. Both are probably true. UNESCO has designated several Mesopotamian sites as World Heritage Sites. URUK, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, Ashur, but many are in danger. From war, from neglect, from the simple fact that mud brick doesn't last. The temples are melting. The ziggurats are eroding. The palaces are crumbling. In another century, there may be nothing left. except the tablets. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. In museums around the world, most of them still unread, untranslated, waiting for scholars to decode them. Each one a voice from the past. A message in a bottle thrown across 5,000 years. Shopping lists, love letters, court cases, medical prescriptions, prayers, curses, stories, the ordinary lives of ordinary people, preserved in clay. This is what survives. Not the kings, not the empires, not the monuments, but the words. The Mesopotamians understood this. They knew that words were immortal. That's why they wrote everything down. That's why, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's final realization is not about living forever. It's about being remembered. Go up on the wall of Uruk and walk around, the epic says. Examine its foundation, inspect its brickwork thoroughly. Is not its masonry of baked brick? Did not the 7 sages themselves lay out its plans? The city will crumble, the king will die, but the story will remain. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of Mesopotamia. They taught us that we are mortal, but our words, our ideas, our creations can outlive us. 5,000 years later, we're still reading their stories, still using their numbers, still building on their foundations. The kings are dust, the cities are ruins, but the mind of Mesopotamia lives on. In every law, every equation, every written word, they built the cradle of civilization, and we are still rocking in it. And so, our journey ends. We've walked through 5,000 years, from the first mud brick cities to the fall of Babylon, from the invention of writing to the birth of empire. We've seen the brilliance and the brutality, the science and the superstition, the laws and the curses. This is the Mesopotamia they never taught you in school, not the sanitized version, not the museum display, but the real thing, dark, complex, human. If you made it this far, thank you. Truly. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments, what surprised you most? What do you want to explore next? Because there are more forgotten empires, more untold stories, more journeys into the darkness, and I'll be here, waiting to guide you. Until next time, sleep well. Dream of ancient cities. And remember, everything you are came from somewhere, and now you know where.